So as promised, today's video is going to be about toxic masculinity and whether I think it's real or not. I'm going to attempt to steelman both sides of the argument and give my opinion throughout and kind of give a conclusive overall opinion of mine at the end. So in order to determine whether something is real or not, we first have to define what that thing is. And in my opinion, defining what toxic masculinity is actually the hardest step towards determining the legitimacy of its existence. And this is because, from what I can tell, everybody seems to have a different idea as to what the term means. Or even more importantly, what the motivations behind using the term or not using the term are. So first, I'm going to steelman, as I said, people who are in favor of using the term, people who say they believe it's real and who use the term. So I'm going to try to take the strongest argument, not the stupidest ones, because there's a lot of stupid ones out there, and there's also a lot of good ones out there, so I'm going to try to take the strongest one, and I'm not going to waste my time on dumb arguments. So by the book, from what I can tell, toxic masculinity is simply a term used to describe negative types of masculinity that are negative towards both women and also men. In my experience, perhaps even in engaging in a conversation with somebody who uses the term toxic masculinity, they may even say something like, toxic masculinity is not a term used to shame men or traditional positive masculinity, but is rather a term used to inform people that they're just like femininity, masculinity has negative and positive traits. And the term toxic masculinity is simply a phrase used to describe the negative forms of it. Not to say that masculinity itself is toxic or negative, but that there is toxic masculinity and positive masculinity. And some people may even say something like there is toxic femininity and positive femininity. Now that's a conversation for a different video. Now personally, this is where my opinion comes in. I personally don't find that to be that illogical. I actually even agree with that standpoint. There is no denying that masculinity can be used for evil, and it can be used for good. There is no denying that masculinity, just like femininity, has positive and negative forms, or when pushed to its extremes, it can be negative. The same sort of masculine aggression, for example, that rapes and murders, also defends and protects. The same sort of masculine drive, let's say, that destroys cities, also builds them. And so, yeah, to me, that argument there's nothing really that radical to me. Even if it's radical and it's true, I'll still agree with it if it's true. I don't care whether it's moderate or radical. But even so, it's not radical, and I also don't think it's false. I personally don't actually disagree with that standpoint. Now again, I am steelmanning this argument, and I'm going to try not to focus on the dumb arguments, because there are a lot of dumb arguments against using the term, or believing that it's not real. And again, I'm not going to waste my time on dumb arguments. So, many people who don't believe that toxic masculinity is real, or they don't use the term, actually, in my experience, this is again taking the strongest arguments, they actually agree with everything I previously said. Everything I said about what toxic masculinity is, the strongest arguments, they actually don't disagree with it. They actually, a lot of times from what I can tell, they don't disagree that masculinity can be negative. Their argument, though, is that they don't believe that the term toxic masculinity, that what people say it means, is actually the way that they're behaving in real life when the term is brought up in conversations. So this sort of reminds me of an interview I once watched on a popular podcast called The Joe Rogan Experience. And it was with a astrophysicist, pretty popular, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I'm a huge fan of. And he was explaining how the reason that he doesn't call himself an atheist is because the way a lot of atheists behave in real life isn't what he believes. And so he then goes on to say, if you look up the word atheist in the dictionary, it kind of describes me, but if atheists in real life aren't acting that way, then he can't be an atheist. Then that's not what he is then. And so what I think the argument here is that the way the definition of a word plays out in real life situations is probably more of a testament of what the phrase actually means than just what the ink says on paper. And I think that the argument against using the term toxic masculinity is the same. At least the strongest arguments. There are people who don't believe that masculinity can be negative. Sure, there's people out there like that. But the strongest arguments for people who are against using the term, that's usually their argument. That they just don't believe that that's really what they're talking about. Because there's a lot of examples that they think of where it doesn't actually line up with what people say the term means in a simple conversation. So many people who don't believe that, who think that that's just an excuse or an attempt to not talk about things that are negative, like rape, or just an attempt to say that, to justify all these terrible negative masculine things, they probably just kind of think that that's just an excuse to not use the term. And so this is where real life examples have to come in then. And I personally have a lot that I can bring up here, a lot of examples where I'm like, it's not toxic masculinity just because a guy doesn't want to wear makeup, like things like that. But I'm just gonna quote one here because it could take all day to quote all of them that I've ever seen. So I literally just typed into the Google search bar. I have my computer right here. Toxic masculinity examples. And one of the first links that popped up was an article called The Top 10 Toxic Masculinity Behaviors at a website called Aurora New Dawn. And so I'm going to read this list to you guys, and then I'm going to go through some of them, not all of them. I just don't feel like it's worth it to go through all of them. I'm going to go through some of them and give examples as to why I don't think it's necessarily toxic masculinity. At least not all of them. So here's the list. Being stoic, being promiscuous, championing heterosexuality as the unalterable norm, being violent, being dominant, sexual aggression towards women, not displaying emotion, not being a feminist ally, risk-taking, and not engaging in household chores and caregiving. So there are some things on this list that any rational person, any rational and moral person, is going to agree that is wrong. And so those things would be things like the sexual aggression towards women, or being violent. No, I would add being unnecessarily violent, like self-defense and protection and defending, that's fine. But yeah, I agree, being unnecessarily violent is a form of, I don't use the term toxic, but for the sake of this conversation, I will agree it is a form of toxic masculinity. So yeah, I don't think that that's irrational, but there are some of these, again, not all of them I'm going to go over, but some of these that I think that they're either not inherently toxic masculinity, or they're just completely not toxic masculinity at all. And so I'm going to go through some of those. So I actually didn't know what stoic meant, and so I'm looking at my computer here, so that's why I keep looking down. So I looked it up on Google, and so, yeah, apparently what stoic means is a person who can endure pain or hardship without showing their feelings or complaining. So here's my problem with this as an example of toxic masculinity. I'll speak for myself. I can agree that there are some situations where it is toxic to tell men to be stoic. So for example, if you're a little boy and you were just raped, and, your classmates or your father, your mother, whoever it is, tells you to just man up. That's a stupid example, and a stupid time to tell a boy to man up. Like, I believe that there are some times where it actually is justified to say, like, grow some balls, man. But there are other times where it's like, you don't tell a boy who was just raped that he's not a man if he talks about it. That's obviously an example where we need to be letting men show their emotions, and we can't be shaming men for showing their emotions. And I do think that there's still cultures inside our country. I don't think it's the dominant culture, but I do think there are subcultures of families or whatever that do still think that this is okay and that needs to change. Now, having said that, I think that a lot of times shame men for being stoic when it's actually a good thing that they are being stoic. So maybe this is a little weird, but I'm actually going to cite to a movie that I watched that I actually like, and it's somewhat of a teen coming of age movie. It's called The Age of 17. Um, Woody Harrelson and Haley Steinfeld is in it. If you guys want to watch it, I like it. I like those kinds of movies, and so I know it's just a story, but I do think that stories have value here. So I'm going to give an example in this movie. So in this movie, the main character's a girl. She has a brother and a mom, and her dad died. Spoiler alert: her dad dies. And in the movie, it clearly takes a hard toll on everyone, the mom and the brother and her, but it takes a really hard toll on the mother, and also on the sister, on her. And it takes a hard toll on the brother too, but you can tell throughout the movie that the brother sort of takes up this role of the father, because there's no longer a father in the house. You know, there's this hole missing in the family. There's this masculine, fatherly figure that is missing now, and so someone has to take over. Someone has to fill that hole, fill that role. And for me, at least now that I know what the word stoic means, at least according to this definition, I think throughout the movie that he was being a stoic person. He was being a stoic man in the sense that he was taking it upon himself to endure the pain but not constantly show emotion. Because if he always showed his emotion, then he would have felt like he was burdening he would have maybe made his mom feel like she was a burden to him, or he wouldn't. Personally, I think that this is an example of a man being a man doing the right thing, which is unfortunately not very common today. And you know, there are some times in the movie where you can tell like it was getting to him, and being stoic, in my opinion, wasn't justified, and he needed to talk about it. He needed to show his emotions, and that's fine. There's like, if you guys go watch the movie, you don't have to. I like it even just for fun, for entertainment, but even for the sake of this example, if you want to watch it. There are some times in the movie where like you can tell he needed to get it off his chest, and telling him to man up probably wasn't justified. But I think that sometimes being stoic is actually a good thing, and actually what is needed, and is actually an example of bravery. And so that is why I don't think that being stoic is inherently toxic masculinity. And so that's my problem with this example. And so it's just how never showing emotion is actually a sign of weakness, I think so is always showing emotion. I think that I think it's true both ways, and I think that it's not good to say that being a stoic man is inherently toxic. So let's go to another one. So being promiscuous. Now, on a personal note, I'm a big advocate for being monogamous sexually, not dating. That's a different conversation, and I'll probably make another video about monogamy, and that's a topic for another video. But for the sake of this conversation, I want to say that it's not inherently toxic masculinity to be promiscuous. Meaning, it's one thing to tell society we need to stop shaming women for having sex. That's one thing. It's another thing to say, well, okay, well, we can shame men for having sex too then. Now, personally, like I said, I'm a big advocate for not being promiscuous for both men and women. That's, again, I'll probably make a video about that another day to elaborate why, and why I think it's good for both of us. But, for the sake of this conversation, yeah, I don't think that it's justified to shame men for being sexually active because women are shamed. I don't think that's the way to go about doing things. So I'm going to go through a few more. Not being a feminist ally. Look, this one really is as simple as not identifying with the movement isn't inherently toxic. There's a lot of people all over the political spectrum who have their own critiques of the modern feminist movement. It's not just a right thing, it's not just a left thing, it's everyone. I know a lot of people everywhere who have something they don't like about the modern feminist movement. And so this one really is just as simple as that it's not toxic to not identify with the movement. So, risk-taking. This is one of my least favorite ones because it is the one in the list that I think is inherently an attack on not even just masculinity, but like positive masculinity. Like, risk-taking is a good thing. Now, there are of course pros and cons to it, but there's pros and cons to everything. And we need people in society who are more prone to doing it and taking the risk, and we need people who are a little bit more cautious. We need both of those kinds of people, and I think that, studies do show that men are more risk-taking, and it's not completely socially constructed, that there are brain wiring, there's biological reasons behind this. This is a general rule. Doesn't mean that if you're talking to an individual who's male, you can automatically assume that, or female automatically assume that they're not. But as a general rule, we do know this. And so I think that this one is just, it's my least favorite one because it's like the most obviously an attack on like men and like positive masculine traits. Like there's no denying that like I personally think that people should try to have a balance in their lives between femininity and masculinity. But I don't think that you know, if someone is a little bit more of a risk taker. Like, I don't think we should be shaming them for that. We need those kinds of people, and we need the kinds of people who are a little bit more cautious too. And so I really don't like that one. So let's go through, I think this is the last one I'm going to go through. So the last one I'm going to do is not engaging in household chores and caregiving. So I agree that as a father, you have a responsibility to take care of your children. And if you don't, you're a shitty father. If you can and you don't, you're a shitty father. You're a shitty person. That's my opinion. However, I do think that there are different ways to care for a child. And I don't think that we should be telling men that if they don't want to do the chores and they don't want to be the primary caregiver, that is inherently toxic masculinity. I think it's up for each couple, each family, whatever, to decide for themselves how they want to, balance out the roles and the jobs. Just like it's not wrong to look for a woman to do the chores and be the primary caregiver, it's not wrong to be a woman and look for a man to do the chores and be the primary caregiver. Either way, it's not wrong. So it's just a preference on what you want. And we shouldn't be shaming men for that. We shouldn't be shaming women for that either. We shouldn't be shaming people for having a preference. What would be toxic is when you are forcing someone to do something they don't want to do. Or when you're agreeing to something you don't want. That's what is toxic. But having a preference with two consensual people who maybe the woman's like, yeah, I do want to be the primary caregiver. I don't want to have a paid career. I love taking care of children. I love doing chores. And the guy's like, well, I love the exact opposite of that. We're a perfect match. Or maybe it's the exact opposite. Or there's a balance. Whatever it is. We shouldn't be shaming people for the preferences. It's good to shame people or to shame the action of doing things that are unconsensual. That's different. But being a man and not wanting to do the chores and caregiving, not necessarily toxic masculinity. That's just a preference. And I think this comes from a place of not believing that there's some women out there who really do want that. And that's a topic for another video that I'll probably make someday about feminism. Or at least modern feminism. I'll go deeper into that in another video. But I think each couple should decide for themselves what percentage or whatever that they want to do. I don't think we should be shaming people for their preferences so long as it's consensual. Here's my overall opinion. Masculinity, just like femininity, can be toxic. There's no denying that. It can be toxic. But I do agree with the second take. Just like I also agree with the first take. But I agree with the second take that I mentioned. That the first take isn't really what is a lot of times played out in real life. I see this in my Facebook feed. I see this in so many places. There's so many examples I could cite here. But that was just one. But like I saw an example of little boys wanting to play guns instead of playing with dolls. There's actually gendered. There are studies that show that like chimpanzees have gendered behavior. It's not socially constructed. Now there are some social constructions within it for sure. There's no denying that your environment can affect your brain and vice versa. But to say that it's completely socially constructed and that it's a result of the patriarchy for these things, I don't think that's true, and the science doesn't play that out either. I think that the problem here is a value problem. We tend to value masculine things over feminine things, which is really unfortunate. But again, that's a topic of another video. So I do agree with the second take more, but I also see both sides, and I agree with the steelman argument of the first take and the steelman argument of the second take. I agree with both of those takes. I'm not saying this just to be a neutral person. I think neutrality for the sake of neutrality is actually evil. I really do think that. But I do believe with both sides, but I lean more on the critiquing for using the phrase, because I've seen that. And I've noticed how it isn't really what they mean when they use the phrase anymore. Even if there may have been a time where it was. When it comes to these kinds of conversations, not just with toxic masculinity, but any kind of politicized phrase, I personally believe that it's no longer useful to use these phrases. Whether it's phrases like toxic masculinity, white privilege, all these kinds of slogans that no one knows what they mean because everybody has a different idea of what it means. And if it means anything, then it means nothing. And so if you're engaging in a conversation with somebody and they're using these terms, try not to assume what they believe. I would personally advise everyone, in my opinion, to just avoid using the terms automatically. Just as not everybody who uses the term toxic masculinity believes that men are toxic and bad, so too, not everybody who doesn't use the term toxic masculinity advocates for rape and violence and murder. We can't be putting people in boxes because, humans have a need to put people in boxes, but once you're aware that as a human being you have that instinct, you can overcome that. And I think that when it comes to these political conversations, we have to be listening to each other. We have to be willing to... We have to enter conversations assuming that the other person is in good faith and that they have reasons for why they believe the things that they believe. And if we're not doing that, we're not really having a conversation. So assume that the other person you're talking to has legitimate reasons for believing what they believe, and it's not just a power game. That they have concerns just like you. And just because they disagree with you doesn't mean that they don't want the best for mankind.